Another week, another scandal involving the increasingly beleaguered Greater Manchester Police. Video shared on social media shows a man lying on the floor of Manchester Airport, now named online by his lawyer as Fahir. A police officer, already pointing a taser, kicks Fahir in the face, hard, and then stamps on his head. The officer has now been suspended and the matter referred to the police watchdog. The release of the footage saw hundreds descend on Rochdale Police Station on Wednesday, chants of GMP shame on you echoing in the night. And little wonder, for this incident follows the release of the final report from the Baird inquiry, which found widespread unlawful behaviour by Greater Manchester police officers. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of The Daily, we will ask what on earth is going on within Greater Manchester Police. Later, we'll get one former officer's take on events at Manchester Airport. But first, we start with our North of England correspondent, Shingi Mararike, joining us from Rochdale, indeed, from outside the police station where we saw those protests just 24 hours ago. Shingi, let's start at the start, shall we? Walk us through what we see in this video. Many people will have seen it, but let's just try and sum up, if we can, that which has caused so much consternation.
Yeah, that video is doing the rounds on social media, and as you say, it's caused a lot of consternation and it's had so much of a response. And what you see is a police officer alongside a group of police officers responding to an incident. And that officer is pointing his taser at a man who's lying on the floor. He's prone. He's got his arms by his side. And he then kicks the man in the head before stamping on his head. The same officer then goes over to another man who sat down. He appears to force him to the ground before hitting him round the head with his taser. And that clip, and in particular those moments in that clip, have been shared far and wide with lots of commentary on the use of force, on what may have led up to it, the broader context. It's been not just a conversation starter, but it's dominated the news today.
It certainly has, and I suspect part of the reason for that is, just the sheer force that is applied when the officer kicks the individual on the ground. But do we know what led up to this incident? Why the police at Manchester Airport were acting in this manner towards these individuals?
So as part of their response, the police put out a statement. That's one of 4 statements and counting over the last 24 hours. But in their first statement, they tried to add a bit more context as to what happened. So they say that they were called to reports of an assault. They had seen the person, a man, on CCTV footage using a cash machine. They also say that when the officers were responding to those reports of an assault, they were assaulted themselves, with one of the officers, a female officer, breaking her nose, other officers having to go to hospital with injuries. And that's their version of events up until that footage. And I think it's worth saying that that's a shorter clip, but there are a few other longer clips on social media showing other people involved. We know 4 people were arrested, and also showing the clamour, the commotion, the sound, the noise of the whole incident itself. So clearly chaotic scenes, but the police are saying that they were there to essentially make an arrest for an assault before all of this unfolded.
But when we have been speaking to the police, and of course we've heard from the Assistant Chief Constable, we've heard from others, speaking directly to the media, they are holding their hands up, aren't they, Greater Manchester Police, admitting that this is not the way that they should have behaved.
Yeah, and there's a few notable things about their responses. One of the things is that they admit that it would shock people to see that sort of force used on camera and that it's unusual. And I think it's the sort of thing that you don't always get in a police statement. I'm just looking back at some of the words that they've put out over the course of the last 24 hours, and they also are responding to community concerns with the protest and the fact that people may be alarmed by what they had seen as well. And as you say, they've referred themselves to the IOPC, the watchdog, who would then take a closer look at the case. So there is that element of knowing that they really need to now manage the optics around this. They need to manage the way it looks, and they also need to explain that it's being looked at. One thing that a lot of people pointed to, though, in their initial response was the fact that the officer was taken off duty, but he wasn't immediately suspended until this morning. So that's something people will be asking questions about. But a lot of their responses are trying to quell community concerns, trying to add context, and trying to essentially tell people, look, this is being looked into further, it's being investigated now, and we've referred ourselves to the relevant bodies. There has been this constant discussion around that footage because it is so striking, so alarming to many people. It's been described as disturbing and distressing. The Prime Minister's been asked about it. You've had the policing minister comment, the Home Secretary's being obviously looped into the conversations. The general discussion around it, the noise around it, is only growing louder hour by hour.
An interesting intervention then from the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who of course kind of operates in the role of Police and Crime Commissioner in the region. He has, direct responsibility for what is going on. Tell us what he was saying.
So he essentially agreed with the suspension, first of all. He said that is right. But then he said that there's more context to the situation because he's seen more of the footage than other people, and I think that's worth reflecting on, that Andy Burnham will be privy to more information than a lot of us.
It's a fast moving and complicated situation in a challenging location, obviously at the airport. It is not clear cut, I would say, and there are issues for both sides in the situation. That said, and here's where I want to be really clear, it is right that the officer has been suspended.
And then there's that call for calm, because another dimension, and I know we're going to get onto it, another dimension to this story is how it's being received by the public here in Rochdale, but also further afield.
Yeah, but talk to us about those protests, because undeniably they were a reaction to the release of this video. And let's not forget, a police officer, an armed police officer, kicking someone in the head and then stamping on the head. You can understand why that alone would have prompted protest. But this is all set against the backdrop, isn't it, of Greater Manchester Police, the Baird Review, and the accusation that this police force has acted unlawfully on many, many occasions.
Yeah, you can't take these things in a vacuum. The hundreds or so people who came here yesterday were chanting GMP, shame on you, voicing their anger at the way that those people have been treated in the footage. And I think that is something that the police in their statements, Andy Burnham in his statements, are trying to quell and trying to reflect on, saying that all the processes are taking place, all the procedures we can are sort of in train, but there is that anger. And like you say, the Baird Review was this time last week. That was a huge story which came off the back of a lot of Sky News coverage of Greater Manchester Police's use of strip search, the way they treated women and minorities as part of that. And that had the microscope on this force literally 7 days ago. And whenever you're talking about policing stories and incidents that catch fire like this, you put the policing stories in their wider context. And the wider context now is a growing sense of public distrust, a growing sense that there are elements of policing that need scrutiny. This is another one in that saga of events that need scrutiny here in Greater Manchester.
Shingi, is Greater Manchester Police Force, is it broken? Because it certainly looks that way from where I'm sitting.
They're under pressure. Pressure today, but pressure that's put in the context of the Baird Review, pressure that's put in the context of the wider mistrust in police, and the fact that there will be people here who will be here again tonight to protest if they don't see progress in the way they want there to be. This is a story that could run and run just because of the fact that you're not looking at this in a goldfish bowl, you're looking at this in its broader context, and that broader context is one in which Greater Manchester Police have had to manage the optics of a number of issues that are making headlines and are putting them under pressure and are essentially revealing them to have made mistakes in the way they've handled a number of communities.
And I suspect that will mean that GMP will be policing this evening's protests in whatever form they take very, very carefully indeed.
There will be. And I think how they police it is important, but it's also an incredibly delicate situation. So last week I covered a riot in Leeds in which the police seemed to be at the heart of it initially, but then they stood off and they stayed away from the situation. They spoke to community members on the ground and they took an approach that felt more hands-off, but was one in which they were trying to manage and navigate a difficult situation. This you can't compare like for like, But what I think they will be doing is trying to delicately handle community concerns, which is why a common thread across all the commentary we've had from figures here in Greater Manchester, be that the police or Andy Burnham, is a call for calm in the community based off the anger that people are feeling about this situation.
Shingi, thank you. A quick pause, then we'll be back with a former Metropolitan Police officer. Welcome back. It is difficult to look at the video of what happened at Manchester Airport and not rush to judgment. But that is what the Labour Mayor, Andy Burnham, has asked people to do, calling for calm ahead of yet another set of protests expected Thursday night. Yet he has seen footage that we have not. Graham Wettone is a former detective and Sky's police commentator. I mean, Graham, when you look at the video that we have seen, and of course, bearing in mind that Andy Burnham has seen some other footage, what strikes you?
Well, I was quite shocked to see such a high level of force being used, albeit, as ever with these incidents, we've got a very small snippet of a much larger incident. So officers have been assaulted prior to those officers attended the scene, sustained fairly serious injuries, so some required hospital treatment. And then these other officers have arrived, dealt with the suspect, in inverted commas, and then used a level of force they decided was proportionate, reasonable and necessary at that time based on information they've got, risk and threat they faced. But it's down to the officers using the force to justify their use of force.
I'm just wondering how anyone can justify a police officer coming up to him, not just tapping him in the face. That was a kick to the head. I just can't see what justification there could possibly be for that.
I fully accept that. And again, myself, other serving and retired officers have looked at that clip and wondered what the justification is. But in our system, in the legal system, in the police training, etc., every officer is told you have to justify each use of force. It isn't just the kick and the stamp, it's each separate one. So every time you use force, you have to assess the risk and threat you, your colleagues and the public face at that specific time. If one use of force doesn't negate that threat and risk, then you can escalate it to another use of force. And it's down to the officer themselves to explain the full context, the full picture, and why they felt that use of force was what they needed to use to deal with that situation.
But when it comes to the use of force, as you say, police officers of my acquaintance have long shown me and told me about the techniques that they are taught from day one of entering police college. I cannot remember a single one of them describing to me the day that they were taught how to kick someone in the head.
Officer safety training, we used to go about twice a year, so you are regularly taught it. The head is so it's totally out of bounds, but it's like the last point of call, the last tactic you would consider using, and it has to be based on a significant threat risk that you and your colleagues in the public face. You can use your feet, you can use kicks as a tactic. Bear in mind, firearms officers or taser officers will have their hands occupied or full with the taser or the firearm, etc. So you might have your hands to use to distance yourself or distance the suspect. But in the video we've seen, that particular individual is on the floor, prone on the floor. So it's up to the officer to assess if they pose a threat or risk, and if they do, how they're going to negate that or distance themselves, their colleagues and the public from that individual. The officer has some questions to answer, and we've seen now Greater Manchester Police have taken the decision to suspend the officer pending the IOPC inquiry.
Just on a related point, the fact that this incident took place at Manchester Airport, the fact that the officers were armed, would that exacerbated the situation? Is there a different security profile when you are at an airport rather than a couple of cops on the beat?
You're right to point out. Clearly there is at airports that there is a risk of attacks, terrorism, etc. So there's a heightened level of awareness, security by officers working there, but you go back to the context of what they're being called to, what's happened before. And I think it's right that certain politicians have said they've looked at all the video and all the evidence so far that they have, and there is a bigger picture. You're talking about
the Mayor of Greater Manchester there, Andy Burnham. We've already heard from him on the podcast. I mean, you weren't in any way surprised that Greater Manchester's mayor, was quite equivocal about this fast-moving and complicated situation, that it was not clear-cut, that there are issues for both sides.
I was a little bit surprised. Bear in mind that recently we had the bed review into Greater Manchester Police, I think last week, which showed they've got some significant work to do around detainees and strip searches. But I thought that was the most balanced comment I've seen from a politician in the last 24 hours from Mr. Burnham. I thought it was measured and balanced. He's clearly looked at all the information he's been privy to, understood there was a bigger picture, a broader picture. But by the same token, said clearly this needs to now be investigated, as it should be, by the Independent Office of Police Conduct. I thought it was very measured and balanced.
But I suppose the problem for Andy Burnham, for Greater Manchester Police, and indeed for the IOPC, is that there are plenty of people who are rightfully aggrieved at what they saw in that video. They will again be out protesting, as you mentioned they did last night. They want to get answers. But unfortunately, from what you're saying, for this process to run its course, people will have to be patient for those answers.
I know that's not easy to listen to or even understand or accept, but there has to be a process to go through. A legal process, an investigative process. It isn't done overnight. It isn't done quickly. We cannot knee-jerk or react instantly to what we see in a 30, 45-second clip. So the whole thing needs to be looked at and investigated thoroughly. I would hope the IOPC do not take ages to do this. They're not known historically for the swiftness of their inquiries or investigations. So I would hope that they really, grasp this, understand the importance and how key it is that we get a prompt, swift, but thorough investigation, present their findings to the Crown Prosecution Service, and then a decision is made as to what the next course of action is.
Am I wrong to perceive that the kind of the view of policing in situations such as this has probably changed quite significantly over the 20 odd years that I've been working in journalism? And if so, I can't quite put my finger on why that might be, whether there's a different definition of good practice within the police force these days, whether there is a shift in, our own attitude to the way in which the police behave in circumstances such as this, or whether it's just the profusion of camera phones and social media that means we get eyes on situations like this a lot more.
I think it's a combination of all of those factors. You speak to serving officers, which I still do on a daily basis. I never worked in an environment where people filmed literally my every single move when I got out of a police car or turned up at an incident. And that's what they're faced at the moment. I never worked in an environment where I was being second guessed every stage, or an environment where people, little knowledge is a dangerous thing, where people knew their rights, knew their laws, when in fact they don't. And they start telling you how to do your job. So, society has changed. Policing has changed significantly. There are far more officers being assaulted these days on a daily basis. I think I heard the Met Commissioner say the other day, something like 18 officers a day in London. And that's then reflected across the country. So police officers being assaulted on a daily basis is a much more challenging job than it was when I was working at. So I think they are much more guarded in how they deal with incidents. They're much more, they should be, a lot more situationally aware of what's going on around them and the threat and risks they face. People, society has almost taken a dislike to the police because of incidents involving individual officers. And I think that's where we sit at the moment. It's a dangerous place on occasions to go out on the streets in uniform and deal with confrontation. And confrontation is never easy to deal with. There's heightened emotions. People aren't acting as you would expect them to normally. And you have to deal with that and almost like try and bring it down into semblance of order. How you use force, though, is key to this. And clearly you're going to be under the microscope when looked at, especially in an airport environment. It's going to be full of cameras all over the place.
Greater Manchester Police. I mean, as we've already mentioned, we've had the Baird inquiry pointing out multiple acts of unlawful behaviour by police. Dame Vera Baird suggesting that police officers were seemingly acting with impunity rather than defending the law. They felt it was their right to be able, if not to break it, then certainly bend it around some of the suspects that were in their custody. I mean, is GMP done?
I think there are significant issues. The Chief Constable, Steve Watson, I think is a very direct, proactive senior officer. I think he actually wants his force to do well. I think he's fully aware of the history and the background that he's inherited from previous regimes. So I think he knows he's got a huge task ahead of him. I've worked in Manchester during my career, albeit it was a while ago now, over 10 years ago now, but it isn't an easy place to work. It is quite challenging, similar to parts of London. So it's difficult for the officers up there. I'm not sure I wouldn't describe them as broken, but I think, like some other forces, they have significant steps to take to reassure the public they are acting in their best interest at all times.
But looking at policing more generally in England and Wales, I just wonder whether this process of restoring trust in the police, the people who are meant to protect us, the people who are meant to look after us, whether that now becomes a generational task rather than something even over maybe a couple, maybe even a handful of years.
I think the majority of people, do still trust and have confidence in the majority of police officers. But clearly policing has an issue with some officers in the service that may be acting outside of the standards and objectives or standards that are expected of a police officer. So I think it's a huge issue for policing to deal with that. It might be generational. I think it's going to take a good few years to regain the trust of the vast majority of the public. I think the majority still do, and it's normally the vocal minority you hear the most of on social media.
Graham, thank you. Trust is a commodity in short supply these days, and once lost, can take an awfully long time to return. So the Mayor's call for calm, for the investigation to be allowed to run its course, may find itself falling on deaf ears. The incident at the airport is just the latest serious complaint about the conduct of officers at Greater Manchester Police, and one they needed like a kick in the face.